An empath does not fall silent because they have nothing left to say, but because they understand precisely what will happen if they keep speaking. Earlier on, their words came from a very familiar belief that if they were clear enough, sincere enough, patient enough, the relationship would move in a different direction. They spoke not to win, but to repair, not to control, but to keep things from collapsing. Yet at a certain point, they come to a difficult truth. Within the structure they are in, words are no longer tools of understanding. They have become fuel for a system that runs on reaction. Every explanation is twisted. Every emotion is remembered not to be understood, but to be reused when convenient. When language no longer leads to connection and only deepens a power imbalance, continuing to speak is no longer communication. It is placing oneself back into the same old position. It is precisely here that silence begins to appear quietly, without announcement, and without any dramatic emotion attached to it. It is not the silence of anger, because there is no need to hurt anyone. Nor is it the silence of hope, because there is no longer any expectation of a response. This silence comes from an internal shift, when a person stops defining themselves through the role they once carried for someone else. Before this, the empath existed as a regulating point in the relationship, the one who kept the rhythm, absorbed tension, and softened unprocessed disturbances. When they withdraw from that role, it is not out of selfishness, but out of the understanding that their presence has been sustaining an unhealthy order. And when the role ends, the language tied to that role naturally becomes unnecessary. A healed empath does not stay silent to be respected more, nor to exert psychological influence. They are silent because they are no longer operating within the same frame of reference. The questions that once haunted them, what should I say? Should I explain more? Is silence too cold? Simply no longer arise. Not because they have become indifferent, but because the center of their psychological life has shifted. They no longer invest their energy in managing other people's reactions. And when one person stops participating, the system that once depended on that participation begins to reveal the emptiness that was always there. This silence therefore carries no message, calls for no change, and asks no one to understand anything. It is simply the sign that someone has withdrawn from a structure they no longer belong to, and from that moment on, the final language they use is sovereign absence. When an empath is still speaking a lot, the price they are paying is not time or patience, but their own nervous energy. Each time they speak to explain, the nervous system has to mobilize to regulate emotion, choose words, anticipate reactions, and self-adjust even before the other person responds. Speaking at this point is no longer natural communication. It becomes a continuous state of strain within a hyper-vigilant system. Explanation, in this context, is not meant to clarify, but unintentionally opens more doors to counter-arguments, to the distortion of meaning, to debates that never lead anywhere. And debate, no matter how gentle or how rational it appears, serves only one function: pulling the empath back into the same old cycle, where they must keep reacting to prevent everything from collapsing. Early-stage empaths do not speak because they lack understanding, but because they have not yet seen the structure they are standing inside. They believe that if they articulate precisely enough, things will be fine. If they are kind enough, the other person will stop. If they stay rational, everything will make sense. But that belief rests on a false assumption, that this system operates on logic and goodwill. The mistake does not lie in the empath's kindness, nor in their sincerity or intelligence, but in applying logic, ethics, and the desire for mutual understanding to a structure that runs on reaction, power, and repetition. In such a system, every word does not bring clarity. It only feeds the cycle to keep turning. And as long as the empath believes that saying the right thing can save the situation, they continue to pay with their own inner vitality and stability. After a long period of explaining, adjusting, choosing words carefully, and self-regulating, the empath's nervous system begins to register a clear, recurring pattern. Each time they speak honestly, tension does not decrease, it increases. Each time they try to clarify, the conversation does not move forward, it loops. This is no longer subjective perception. Many neuroscientific studies show that when a person must constantly monitor another's reactions and modify their speech to avoid triggering conflict, the sympathetic nervous system remains chronically activated, raising cortisol levels and sustaining a state of high alert. In other words, the empath is not only emotionally exhausted, they are being physiologically worn down. Research on cognitive load also indicates that explaining oneself in a psychologically hostile environment forces the brain to expend more energy than usual, reducing self-regulation capacity and leading to mental burnout. But what ultimately causes the empath to stop is not mere fatigue. It is the moment they recognize a fundamental mismatch. Their words are not received to be understood, but to be assessed for influence and control. In this structure, every sentence becomes a test of power rather than a bridge of connection. When someone realizes that anything they share can be used to counter, twist meaning, or trigger another argumentative loop, the brain automatically begins to reduce investment. This is a very natural protective mechanism. When an environment is no longer safe for expression, the nervous system prioritizes withdrawal over continued exposure. Thus, the empath at this stage does not decide to be silent in a moral or strategic sense. They simply no longer see any biological or psychological reason to keep speaking. They begin to feel clearly that every time they open their mouth, they pay with inner stability while the outcome remains unchanged. When this realization repeats often enough, a shift occurs. The empath stops trying to fix the conversational space, stops hoping to be understood, stops investing energy in exchanges that produce no real movement. From this point on, silence is no longer an absence. It is a sign that they have stopped participating in a mechanism that exacts too high a cost from their body and mind for things that were never within their control. The silence of an empath and the silence of a narcissist may look similar on the surface, but their psychological nature is entirely opposite. Confusing these two forms of silence is one of the main reasons many people blame themselves, doubt their own growth, or fear that they are becoming like the one who hurt them. In reality, when we look closely at motivation, nervous system dynamics, and the consequences produced by that silence, we see two phenomena located at opposite ends of the spectrum of psychological development. The silence of a narcissist is never neutral. It always has a purpose. When a narcissist goes silent, it is a deliberate act designed to create an emotional void in another person. This silence often appears suddenly, without explanation, without clear closure, and is accompanied by intense unease on the other side. It is silence used as a behavior regulation tool. It activates anxiety, forcing the other person to wonder what they did wrong, to seek feedback, apologize, explain, or attempt to restore connection. In this case, silence is not withdrawal from the cycle, it is a way of keeping the cycle running without saying anything at all. The narcissist does not go silent to leave. They go silent so the other person moves toward them. From a behavioral psychology perspective, this form of silence resembles punishment through reward withdrawal. When attention, response, or presence suddenly disappears, the other person's brain enters a searching, anxious state. Attachment research shows that unexplained withdrawal in relationships strongly activates the anxious attachment system, especially in empathic individuals. The narcissist's silence, therefore, does not reduce tension in the system. It increases it, forcing the other person to react. It is silence for control, not silence for closure. By contrast, the silence of a healed empath does not activate the cycle, it stops it. The core difference lies here. This silence is not used to provoke a reaction. A healed empath does not monitor who panics, who returns, or who suffers because of their silence. Nor do they time their silence to maximize psychological impact. In fact, they are no longer tracking its effects at all. This may sound simple, but psychologically, it represents a major shift. When someone no longer tracks others' reactions in order to regulate their own behavior, the center of regulation has returned inward. The empath's silence does not arrive suddenly like a shock. It is usually the outcome of a long process in which words gradually diminish because they no longer have a reason to exist. Before full silence, empaths often go through a phase of excessive talking, detailed explanations, and repeated attempts to repair and clarify. When those efforts produce no substantive change, the nervous system learns something very clearly. This environment does not respond safely. And when an environment is unsafe for expression, silence emerges as a self-protective reflex, not as a manipulative strategy. Another important point: the narcissist's silence is always temporary. It is used until the desired reaction is achieved, after which speech, attention, or even kindness returns as part of the cycle. The empath's silence, by contrast, is stable. It is not switched on and off to test reactions. It is not accompanied by observation, probing, or waiting. Once the empath has withdrawn from the system, that silence does not require effort to maintain. It exists naturally as a new psychological state. From a personal development perspective, the empath's silence is a sign of maturity, not of freezing. Many people confuse silence with avoidance, but the difference lies in motivation. Avoidance comes from fear, fear of conflict, fear of emotion, fear of confrontation. Mature silence comes from discernment, knowing what is worth investing energy in and what is not. A healed empath does not fall silent because they cannot tolerate dialogue, but because they no longer see a reason to dialogue in a space incapable of receiving truth. Research on self-regulation and emotional maturity shows that a key marker of psychological growth is the ability to stop behaviors that no longer provide value, even when those behaviors once defined one's identity. Empaths were once the ones who spoke a lot, explained a lot, tried a lot. When they stop, they are not losing a part of themselves. They are abandoning an outdated survival strategy. Silence at this point is not contraction, it is restructuring. Another subtle but crucial difference lies in the internal experience accompanying each type of silence. Narcissistic silence is usually paired with underlying tension, monitoring, and a form of control-based gratification. Empathic silence is paired with a lighter, calmer internal state, even if it initially feels empty. Many people describe that when they stop speaking and explaining, their bodies finally get to rest. Heart rate slows, sleep deepens, and the anticipatory tension before interactions disappears. These are physiological signs that the nervous system has exited a constant fight or appease mode. Most importantly, the empath's silence carries no hidden message. It does not say, "Chase me," nor apologize to me. It does not even say, "I am better than you." It simply reflects an inner truth. I am no longer participating. And when someone no longer participates, all manipulative strategies lose their anchor. This is why empathic silence is often misinterpreted as cold, cruel, or unfeeling by those who once benefited from the empath's reactions. In reality, it is simply the end of a role. Maturity lies in the fact that the empath does not need to prove their silence is right. They do not write a final message explaining why they are silent, nor do they try to distinguish themselves from the narcissist through words. The difference lies in the outcome. Narcissistic silence destabilizes others. Empathic silence stabilizes the self. Narcissistic silence pulls others back into the cycle. Empathic silence ends the cycle. When a narcissist realizes that the empath's silence is real, not silence to wait, not silence to punish, but silence born of withdrawal from the system, their first reaction is not acceptance. It is panic. This panic, however, does not show itself directly. It is masked by escalation. For the narcissist, the silence of someone who once reacted is the most dangerous signal of all. The external regulator has disappeared. When this happens, they are compelled to pull the empath back into the old position, not through a single move, but through multiple successive layers of attack, each designed to test the durability of that silence. The early stage of escalation is often very subtle. The narcissist does not attack outright. They probe. A vague signal is released, a half-spoken sentence, a seemingly accidental action appearing at just the right moment. The goal is not dialogue, but to measure reflex. If the empath responds, even once the narcissist knows the old system still has a pulse, this stage resembles voltage testing. Light, brief, just enough to see where the current still flows. Here, the empath's silence is challenged not by overt pressure, but by the slyness of very small things. When vague signals fail to produce a response, the narcissist moves to the next layer, retelling the old story in a more reasonable form. They may reappear with a calm tone, even an air of maturity, as if everything has been reconsidered. At this stage, words are used as a new disguise, aimed at activating the empath's familiar sense of responsibility. The danger of this phase lies in the fact that it does not look like aggression. It looks like late maturity. If the empath is not fully grounded in their silence, they can easily be pulled back by the feeling that maybe this time is different. Maybe this is a chance for a proper ending. In truth, this is simply a more refined escalation, where the goal is not resolution, but the re-establishment of a channel for reaction. When both ambiguity and reason fail, the narcissist begins to shift into direct emotional pressure. Guilt is activated, moral responsibility is placed on the empath's shoulders, and the past is revisited in distorted ways. The narcissist may play the victim, display collapse, or manufacture a crisis that makes the empath feel that if they do not speak up, the consequences will be severe. This is the stage where the empath's silence is tested most intensely because it strikes directly at their former identity, the one who carries the load, the rescuer, the one who never leaves anyone behind. If the empath speaks again at this stage, the cycle is not only reconnected, it is reinforced with a new, deeper, and more entangled emotional layer. When emotional pressure no longer works, escalation continues through indirect attack. The narcissist begins to influence the empath's surrounding environment. They talk to others, tell the story in ways that benefit themselves, and plant doubt about the empath's silence. The goal is to create enough social pressure that the empath feels compelled to speak up to protect their image. This is where many people break their silence, not because they are still attached to the narcissist, but because they cannot tolerate being misunderstood. Yet this is precisely where the empath's maturity is measured most clearly, whether they are solid enough not to need to correct the narrative in other people's eyes. If all these layers still fail to produce a response, the narcissist enters a more overt stage of attack. Anger appears, language becomes sharp, sometimes demeaning or threatening. This is a final attempt to activate the empath's defensive reflex. The narcissist knows that when attacked, many people will respond verbally to protect their boundaries. But it is precisely the absence of reaction at this stage that shows the empath's silence has shifted from a decision into a state. They are not suppressing themselves. They are no longer in the same psychological space where they can be triggered. What is important to understand is that narcissistic escalation does not follow a fixed sequence. It can loop, change form, or combine multiple tactics at once. But all of it shares one goal: restoring reaction. For the narcissist, The empath's reaction is not just emotion, it is proof of power's existence. When reaction disappears, they lose not only control over the relationship, but also their ego's mechanism of self-regulation. This is why escalation is often accompanied by increasingly visible inner chaos on the narcissist side. For the empath, this is the most difficult phase, not because of external pressure, but because their own silence begins to expose inner gaps. When they no longer speak, explain, or react, old questions surface. Am I being too cold? Am I abandoning someone? Am I becoming the person I once hated? These are not signs of failure, but signs of identity restructuring. The empath is learning how to exist without a role, and this process is always accompanied by temporary disorientation. The challenge of silence lies in the fact that it brings no immediate reward. There is no sense of winning or losing, no validation, no dramatic moment. Instead, there is an initial emptiness, where the empath must regulate their nervous system without relying on familiar interactions. But it is precisely here that the difference between silence as manipulation and silence as maturity becomes clear. The narcissist is silent, so others will react. The empath is silent and learns not to need reactions from anyone. Over time, if the empath maintains this silence, the narcissist's escalation gradually loses momentum. Not because the narcissist comes to understand, but because there is no longer anything to latch onto. Every tactic requires feedback in order to function. When feedback does not arrive, the system weakens on its own. This does not happen immediately, nor does it follow a straight line. But at a deeper level, something has changed permanently. The empath is no longer a regulating component for someone else's chaos. This stage marks the empath's true maturation. Not because they have learned to endure better, but because they no longer place themselves in a position where endurance is required. Their silence is no longer an experiment. It is a new foundation. And once this foundation is established, every escalation from the narcissist becomes mere external movement, no longer capable of shaping the empath's inner life. This is when the empath understands something very clearly. Silence is not something that must be protected through constant effort. It exists naturally once one has withdrawn from the very system that once sustained disorder. After passing through this phase of escalation and testing, the empath enters a state that is easily misunderstood if seen only from the outside. They withdraw, slow down, communicate less, and intentionally spend more time alone. To outsiders, especially those accustomed to viewing life through extroverted or achievement-oriented lenses, this state is often quickly labeled as withdrawal, insecurity, avoidance, or even not having moved on. But such interpretations miss a core point. This is not withdrawal out of fear, but withdrawal because there is no longer a need to expend energy on unnecessary connections. After a long period of living in constant reaction, the empath's nervous system requires an entirely different environment in order to reorganize. In the previous phase, they existed as a point of intersection for too many emotional currents, expectations, and conflicts. Every interaction demanded vigilance, reading signals, adjustment. When that cycle ends, the most natural response is not to rush into new relationships, but to create enough empty space for the body and mind to relearn safety without having to do anything for anyone. Being alone at this stage does not mean isolation. It is a very concrete way for the nervous system to lower its alert level and for biological rhythms to return to stability. At this stage, the empath is not seeking stimulation. They do not need long conversations, constant sharing, or to be seen. What they need is a space where no one demands reactions, no one needs soothing, and no one unconsciously places emotional regulation responsibilities on them. In solitude, they begin to experience something very new. Quiet no longer equals emptiness. In the past, quiet often triggered anxiety because it was associated with abandonment or loss of connection. Now, quiet becomes neutral, even pleasant, because it no longer carries threat. This phase is easily misread because, from the outside, there are few visible signs of progress. The empath does not tell their story, analyze further, or try to prove that they have become stronger. They do not redefine themselves through others' perceptions. Yet internally, a very deep process is unfolding. They are learning how to exist without a role. No longer the healer, no longer the most understanding one, no longer the bearer of burdens. In solitude, they begin to feel themselves as an independent individual, not as a function within someone else's life. This withdrawal is not permanent. It is not a declaration against the world, but a necessary phase for resetting internal standards. When no longer pulled into constant interaction, the empath gains clarity about what exhausts them, what calms them, and what truly matters. Relationships once maintained by obligation, habit, or a sense of responsibility naturally fall away, not because the empath has become cold, but because they no longer have the motivation to remain present in spaces that require them to shrink. At this stage, empaths often develop a new relationship with themselves, not in a narcissistic or self-glorifying way, but in a very practical one. They begin to trust their own perceptions more than others' explanations. They no longer need to share every thought in order to confirm its validity. They do not require constant feedback to know they are okay. This confidence is quiet. It shows up in comfort with their own rhythm, with silent evenings, with not always having answers for others. Outsiders may call this withdrawal, but in truth, it is selection. The empath is learning not to open the door to everything simply because they have the capacity to receive. They begin to distinguish clearly between nourishing connection and draining connection. And to do that, they need time alone, not to escape the world, but to establish strong enough inner boundaries before entering any new interaction. Most importantly, this phase marks a fundamental reversal. The empath no longer seeks safety in relationships, but in their own capacity to be alone. When someone is no longer afraid of being alone, they are no longer easily drawn into structures built on scarcity. And from this quiet foundation, if and when they return to the world, it will no longer be as someone who needs to be chosen, but as someone who participates only when it truly aligns with their life. After the healing phase, the first thing the empath notices is not the arrival of love, but the absence of the need for love. This is the point many people misunderstand. They assume healing is about loving again more quickly, more correctly, or attracting a better partner. But for empaths who have gone deep enough, healing does not lead directly to love. It leads to a state of being where love is no longer a condition for feeling whole. And it is precisely this paradox that becomes the only doorway to real love. Previously, the empath's love always carried an unspoken task: soothing, balancing, healing, or rescuing. They loved through endurance, through over-understanding, through placing others' needs above their own inner safety. This did not stem from a lack of ethics, but from a psychological structure formed very early. Love as a way to stay, not be abandoned, and have value. When that structure collapses through healing, the empath does not open their heart in the old way anymore. They close a form of love that has become obsolete. Real love after healing does not begin with intense chemistry. It does not begin with the feeling of strangely familiar. On the contrary, many empaths describe that when they meet a healthy person, their first reaction is nothing special, no high, no obsession, no desperate desire to be chosen. And it is precisely this ordinariness that once made them doubt themselves. Have I lost the ability to love? In reality, they have simply lost the ability to love in an addictive way. Real love that comes to an empath after healing does not activate a stressed nervous system. It does not make them second-guess meanings, does not force them to contort themselves to keep connection, and does not keep them awake at night out of fear of saying the wrong thing or doing the wrong thing. The baseline state of this love is safety. And for someone who has lived for years inside emotional strain, safety can initially be mistaken for blandness. But if they stay long enough, the empath realizes something profoundly different. They do not need to become the best version of themselves in order to be loved. They only need to be themselves. One very clear feature of real love after healing is this: it does not require the empath to trade solitude for attachment. Before, empaths often entered relationships to escape an inner emptiness. But after healing, they have learned how to be alone without collapsing. So when love appears, it does not save them from loneliness. It simply walks beside someone who is already standing. This changes the entire relational dynamic. There is no more clinging, no more fear of loss, no more endurance for the sake of holding on. If the relationship is no longer aligned, the empath can leave without losing themselves. Real love also does not demand that the empath continually explain their inner world. One of the clearest signs is this: they do not have to talk excessively in order to be understood. Not because the other person can read their mind, but because there is no need to defend. There are no long debates to prove their feelings are reasonable. There is no sense that they must keep everything okay. When conflict arises, it is addressed, not stored. And when it is not addressed, the empath does not automatically assume responsibility for repairing it. Most importantly, love after healing does not make the empath shrink. Before, they often had to reduce themselves, lower their needs, diminish their expectations so the relationship could survive. But in real love, there is no shrinking. Not because they demand more, but because no one asks them to be less. They do not have to surrender their quiet, sacrifice their personal rhythm, or trade their boundaries to prove devotion. This love does not require them to keep giving in order to be kept. One difficult but deeply true point is this: real love after healing does not appear often. Many empaths heal and then spend a long time loving no one, not because they are not attractive, but because they no longer fit most relational structures out there. They are no longer easily drawn into relationships built on scarcity, idealization, or rescue fantasies. So, when real love comes, it often comes slowly, quietly, without noise. But when it does arrive, it does not cost them themselves. After healing, empaths also no longer attract narcissistic love. Not because they become stronger in a performative sense, and not because they learn a few defensive techniques or become cold. The change happens at a much deeper layer. The internal structure the narcissist once latched onto no longer exists. And when that structure disappears, the attraction dissolves on its own, without effort, without pushing, without resistance. A narcissist is not drawn to a person in the full sense. What they seek is always a psychological function, someone who can mirror, regulate, absorb, and compensate for an inner void they cannot carry on their own. Before healing, the empath unconsciously matched that function perfectly. They could listen deeply, endure intensely, remain emotionally flexible, and most crucially, self-adjust to preserve connection. This created a very particular softness in their psychological field, not weakness, but accessibility and penetrability. The narcissist did not have to conquer. They only had to slide in. After healing, that softness is gone. Not because the empath becomes rigid, but because they are no longer open to being used. They do not emit the signals of ready to carry, ready to understand, ready to fix. In their place is a different state. Clear presence, natural boundaries, and no need to prove worth through giving. For the narcissist, this is an environment with no hooks, no grip to pull on, no gap to wedge into, no feedback to manipulate. Another key shift is that the healed empath no longer broadcasts scarcity. Before, no matter how composed they seemed, they often carried a quiet fear, fear of loss, fear of being left, fear of not being enough. That fear did not need words. It showed in their efforts to keep the peace, avoid conflict, and endure to preserve the bond. Narcissists are extremely sensitive to that signal because scarcity is a direct doorway into power. After healing, the empath no longer needs a relationship to stabilize emotion or identity. Stability comes from within. And when there is no lack, there is nothing to exploit. A healed empath also no longer reads the narcissist in the old way. Before, they could see the pain behind the behavior, and that activated the rescuer instinct. They understood, empathized, and therefore stayed longer than necessary. After healing, the capacity to understand remains, but it no longer leads to participation. They can see motives, tactics, and loops clearly, but that seeing does not produce action. For the narcissist, this is deeply disadvantageous because narcissism can only operate when the other person acts out of understanding. When understanding no longer comes with sacrifice, the narcissist loses their primary instrument. A subtle but crucial point. The healed empath no longer reflexively responds to other people's instability. Before, a shift in atmosphere, a change in tone, or rising tension would automatically trigger self-adjustment. After healing, another person's instability is recognized in its proper place. It belongs to them. There is no rush to fix, no need to soothe immediately. This makes the narcissist feel untouchable, not because the empath builds a wall, but because they no longer vibrate in response. Narcissists are also pushed away by something very ordinary: simplicity. Healed empaths live more cleanly, more clearly, with less drama. They do not participate in emotional games, do not swing wildly, do not need intensity to feel alive. For the narcissist, this simplicity is a lack of fuel. No drama to stir, no conflict to manage, no intense emotion to flip. The relationship becomes psychologically unprofitable. In addition, the healed empath is no longer attractive through predictability. Before, the narcissist could predict reactions. Say this, and the empath will explain, do that. And they will apologize, stay silent, and they will panic. After healing, those reflexes disappear. Not through tactics, but because the empath is no longer living inside the script. This unpredictability does not create attraction, it creates anxiety for the narcissist. And anxiety is what they avoid, not what they seek. Another major change is that the healed empath no longer sells their presence cheaply. Before, they tended to be always available, always present, always responsive. After healing, presence becomes selective. They do not disappear to provoke attention, but they are not available at all times. This breaks an unspoken narcissistic assumption that the other person will always be there when needed. When that assumption collapses, attraction turns into irritation. Most importantly, the healed empath no longer carries the unconscious promise that everything will be okay if you are with me. Before, their mere presence gave others a sense of being held. After healing, they no longer emit that promise. Not because they do not care, but because they understand that each person must carry their own inner life. For the narcissist, the absence of that promise is the clearest sign that the relationship will not serve them. So, the narcissist does not leave because the empath becomes ugly or hard to approach. They leave because the advantage is gone. No reaction, no regulation, no compensation, no role. And in the narcissist's world, where every bond is measured by how well it serves the ego, a person without a function is automatically removed from the field of attraction. This often surprises the empath. They do nothing to push the narcissist away, yet the narcissist still withdraws or redirects. It is not victory, and it is not loss. It is simply the natural result of a structure that has changed. When the empath is no longer a place to escape the self, the narcissist will find another place, one that is still open, still soft, still willing to carry. And here, the empath understands something very quiet, yet definitive. They do not escape the narcissist by fighting back, but by no longer being compatible, no longer resonant, no longer intersecting, no longer any reason to pull each other into the same loop.